My name is Gleb Bobrov. I am a writer, journalist, playwright, and the head of the People's Committee for Culture, Education, and Science in the People's Republic of Lugansk. I was born in 1964 in Lugansk district. After secondary school, I served in the Army in Afghanistan in the 860th Motorized Rifle Regiment based near Faizabad. I was there for 2.5 years, working as a sniper and part-time health instructor.
Вернулся домой после армии в феврале 85-го, поступил работать в школу учителем начальной военной подготовки. Но в 86 году переехал в Луганск и с тех пор живу здесь.
I returned home in February 1985 and taught the basics of military training in secondary schools. I have been living in Lugansk since 1986.
С 2002 года полностью шел в журналистику.
I changed a number of professions from working as an art director in the circus, and I worked in factories. From the early 90s, I began working as a journalist and a writer. My first books were about the war in Afghanistan, first in magazines and then online, and my name became known. In August 2007, I published an online novel which was called An Epoch of Stillborn, which was about a hypothetical civil war in Ukraine. It has been reprinted 6 times. You can find it today in every Russian online library. I was working for the local newspaper for the governor of Lugansk as an editor. 70% of what I described in my book came true. My warning didn't work out, and Ukraine found itself in a horrible civil war. Speaking about my book, I identified the causes of the war, the military battles, hostilities, and the location of the front lines. It was not difficult to guess where the front line was because all the actions were around the main roads. I pointed out the split and mutual hatred that is feeding this war. When Ukraine started to shell and bombard Lugansk, I moved my children to the medical academy in Crimea, where they graduated. I was working with Russian mass media, and I was going in and out of Lugansk. And then in the autumn of 2014, our republic formed a state information agency. I took part in this and have been here since December 2014. I have been a reporter and observer for the Lugansk Information Agency. We are the largest and the only information agency. There are some channels and online platforms, but we are the largest. In December 2014, we united writers, poets, and intellectuals, and we formed the Union of Writers. Along with my duties as a journalist, I am the head of this writers' union. We managed to combine the energy and enthusiasm of all these people and publish their works in several publications. As a journalist, I do interviews, reporting, and feature articles, and I am facing my second war. Speaking about the causes of the conflict in Ukraine, we must remember there are 2 fundamental reasons. First is the ideology of Ukrainian nationalism. When the USSR collapsed and Ukraine was formed as an independent state, it was formed on the ideology of Ukrainian nationalism in all spheres of life. This ideology came from Western Ukraine, and it was artificially fertilized from the outside. One of the sources of this ideology came from the Ukrainian-Canadian diaspora. This ideology was used as a weapon to explain why Ukraine should not be together with Russia. At its core, Ukrainian nationalism is very primitive because it has nothing but the idea of animosity towards Russia. It has a Russophobic sentiment, and if you remove this Russophobic element, it will deflate like a balloon. When the ideology was accepted, it became a time bomb, which had to explode one day because of its anti-Russian beliefs. Second factor is outside interference, which is the so-called consolidated West that is controlled by the United States. What is happening? America is trying to gain total control of the world. Any state that seeks independence immediately faces threats and provocations. And this leads to hybrid threats and pressure such as political, diplomatic, economic, sanctions, and military power as well. When America suddenly realized that Russia was rising and no longer the Yeltsin era, when Russia was lying in the dirt, Americans started implementing sanctions against Russia, including the time bomb called Ukraine. It all began in 2004 with the first attempt of a color revolution in the first Maidan, when people were on the verge of shooting in Kiev. In 2008, the war between Georgia and South Ossetia started, and Russia showed that it was not only capable of protecting its own sovereignty, but it was also capable of using force to protect her allies. This was the trigger that brought us to 2013, when Ukraine was ready to explode. This time bomb was detonated from the outside in 2014. Remember the hysteria in the United States when Russia was accused of interfering in the presidential election? No evidence was ever provided. When Maidan started in Kiev, American politicians, including Victoria Nuland, were strolling through Kiev, supporting the revolution and giving out cookies. Wasn't this a direct interference in the affairs of another country? The war is going on now in Ukraine, and hundreds of American instructors are training Ukrainian soldiers in western Ukraine near Lvov. Isn't this interference in the internal affairs of another country? The United States is delivering ammunition and various weapons, including lethal weapons, to Ukraine. Isn't this interference? This is a policy of double standards, and today America is governing Ukraine through telephone calls. I don't even count the number of expats and foreign advisors working now in Ukraine. You see that Ukraine became a mercenary in the war against Russia. It is not the war where Kiev is fighting against Donetsk and Lugansk, and it is not a war between Kiev and Moscow. It is a war of the United States against Russia on the territory of Ukraine. This is similar to what America is doing in other countries, fighting against Iran and Syria on the territory of Syria and Iraq. The same as the Americans are fighting in Kurdistan against Turkey. Americans only understand the policy of servants and slaves, and any country that doesn't want to be a slave of America immediately becomes its enemy. We saw it in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and other Middle Eastern countries that have recently been destroyed. The war has been raging there now for 50 or 60 years because it is the world's gas station, and America must have influence there. And this means war. Originally, when Maidan started in Kiev, Lugansk had no reaction in the beginning. But when protests turned violent, Lugansk said, while Kiev is jumping, we are working. Americans used the classic technology to manipulate the crowds and turn them into zombies. Do you remember when Victoria Nuland was distributing cookies on Maidan? Do you know what it means? I worked in the circus, and you train animals by giving them cookies. Those people who orchestrated Maidan were so positive in the result that they were convinced that their strategies would be successful. Americans use this technology all over the world. Look what happened in the Middle East with the so-called Arab Spring. It was the same scenario. Look what they do with Navalny's crowds. He is Putin's opponent. Look what they did in Armenia. If these technologies work, why should they create something new? In the beginning, we watched Maidan in shock. But when the events turned into fighting with Special Forces police, when the police were set fire on, our policemen from Donetsk and Lugansk were there, and we realized it was serious, and people started to rise up. We realized that they would do the same to us.
Remember
Remember what they said? No negotiations with Donbass. Maidan won, and you will do what we tell you. Maidan leaders immediately started to pressure the local authorities in southeast Ukraine to remove the law permitting the speaking of Russian. The policy of the Maidan leaders was, we will do what we want, and you will sit in the corner and be quiet, and if you resist, we will break you. The people of Donetsk and Lugansk did not accept these conditions. We organized our own protest meetings, and people demanded the authorities make some decisions. But the authorities had their money and business connections in Kiev, so they fled to Kiev. People were burned in that horrible massacre in Odessa. We realized that they would do the same with us, and people started rising up. Miners, Cossacks, and others organized and attacked the buildings of the security forces, police, firemen, and military draft board where they could get weapons. People realized that they had to protect themselves with arms or be killed. When the fighting started near Donetsk, our journalists were working there and we saw everything on TV. Armed people occupied the buildings when the authorities fled. Some of the police joined the people. Some Afghan veterans got organized and formed a regiment of self-defense forces. They participated in the fighting and are now one of the legendary units. The armies of Donetsk and Lugansk were formed. This was a time when dozens of leaders came from the people. In Ukraine, they talk a lot about Russian troops coming here, but there were no Russian troops. Those were our people, miners, Cossacks, Afghan veterans, and others. On the first checkpoints, people were armed with axes, shovels, and sticks. The most popular gun at that time was a double-barreled shotgun. All the men from local villages were guarding with double-barrel shotguns. There were cases when the guns were taken from the Ukrainian army. I could see from my balcony tank battles between the Ukrainian army and self-defense forces that took place 3 kilometers away. In January 2015, Ukrainian forces bombarded the eastern part of Lugansk. When my wife was hanging laundry on the balcony and shouted, "Gleb, Gleb," I rushed to the balcony and I saw 2 Grads coming in our direction. But they landed 2 kilometers away, destroying part of the markets. The residents of Lugansk have lived through many shellings in this war. When the first volunteers appeared and first checkpoints were manned, people opposed and stopped Ukrainian soldiers without weapons. By summer, when the self-defense units managed to push back the Ukrainian soldiers, Ukraine started shelling and once again used the same American tactics they used in Yugoslavia when they kept shelling civilian districts. People were leaving their houses. No one defended the area, and so the army advanced. But this tactic didn't work in Lugansk, so Ukraine started to shell Lugansk repeatedly. The first shelling took place in June and July 2015. Personally, for me, the most dangerous shelling was the shelling of the market, where many civilians died. This is my district. Some missiles landed in the market, others came towards my house. It was summer and hot, and the air conditioning wasn't working. There was a huge explosion. I ran out to the balcony and saw in the distance a huge black cloud rising from the marketplace. It was rising so fast that in 2 seconds it reached the height of a 5-story building. I served in the Afghan war, and I know that it was not a mortar shell. It was either a 122 millimeter or 152 millimeter artillery shell. We couldn't believe our eyes, and our multi-story building was literally shaking, and the door between my balcony and the storeroom was blown off. Then there was a second explosion. We were thrown back into the hallway. One of our cats was with us, and another was hiding under the sofa. There were no more explosions. My wife started to quickly collect our important documents because we didn't know what would be next. I was standing on the balcony, and I saw a man lying in agony on the ground. 30 meters away from him, there was a woman lying in a big pool of blood whose leg was blown off. Next to her, there was a man praying over her. Then the ambulance arrived and took two people to the hospital. The man who was lying in agony died. That was the first artillery attack. On the 2nd of June, another artillery attack hit the city of Lugansk administration building. I was in the center of Lugansk at the time. I didn't see the explosion itself, but I saw two fighter planes approximately 500 meters away. It was a cloudy day. One was flying above the clouds and one below. They made one approach and then a second, and I knew they were going to fire their missiles because I knew how it was done in Afghanistan. After they launched their missiles, they fired their guns and flew away. The area which was bombed was the city administration building and the Central Park, only 80 meters away. It was during the day. Children were playing in the park. People were entering and leaving the building. This was the most central part of the city, and it was their target. Later, the Ukrainian side explained what happened. They denied that they bombed civilians. They claimed that the self-defense units either bombed their own people or it was an air conditioner that exploded. Please understand, the walls of the city administration building were 1.5 meters thick, and one missile went through the wall on the 4th floor, leaving a hole 1 square meter wide. No air conditioner explosion could do that. The Ukrainians claimed that the self-defense forces used man-pads, portable air defense systems. But man-pads contain only 300 grams of gunpowder. So it is similar to a hand grenade and couldn't do much damage. Plus, there were 20 craters in the park. A lot of people were wounded and 8 people died. Among the dead was the first Minister of Health. This was the first shelling, and later it continued on a regular basis. I told you my personal story, but there were other days when the Ukrainians shelled other southern areas of Lugansk with grads, 120-millimeter shells fired from howitzers. Later, it became like a drunken orgy, because the Ukrainians were very close and began shelling the city with mortars. And always, the Ukrainians claimed the self-defense units shelled ourselves on purpose in order to create hatred towards Ukraine. Finally, when the Ukrainian army retreated, we had fights near the airport, from where Ukrainian troops tried to attack Lugansk. A British journalist witnessed 120-millimeter empty BMP shells piled up 20 meters long and 3 meters high. These shells were fired at Lugansk, damaging more than 1,000 multi-story apartment buildings and more than 2,000 private homes. In hundreds of buildings, supporting walls were damaged. In the center of Lugansk, there is a 27-story building that was shelled and will have to be demolished because its supporting walls were damaged. It was important because it shielded other buildings in the Lenin district of the city. How many people died? There were so many dead people that we didn't have time to bury them. We had no electricity, no water supply, no sewage system. Again, it was the same American tactic used in Yugoslavia. Destroy the infrastructure and people will leave. Some people left Lugansk, but half of the people stayed. Foreigners were surprised how it was possible to live in a city with no electricity, water, and sewage system. But we lived through it. We lived through the terrible months of blockade. We cooked outdoors on outdoor fires. We delivered water in buckets from wells. Nobody knows how many people died. First, people were buried in ditches, but later a mass grave was created. The ambulances brought bodies to the mortuary, and the bodies were lying outside in layers. As a journalist, I was interviewing dozens of people who lived through it. I talked to mothers who were searching for their children. I talked to a woman whose mother was killed in front of her eyes. They all needed death certificates. That was a dreadful time. As a journalist, I discovered interesting details. Do you remember the woman whose leg was blown off near my house? She survived. I talked to the famous doctor who saved her, and he told me how it happened. When she arrived at the hospital, she had lost 3 liters of blood. Miraculously, she arrived alive, and they found the same blood type. and she had a strong heart to live through it. Her leg was amputated up to the crotch. When the doctor entered the ward to visit her after the surgery, she wasn't there. She couldn't leave the ward. She couldn't even walk with crutches. She had rolled under the bed because she heard artillery fire. She asked the doctor from under the bed if they had stopped shelling. It was summer. The heat was up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no electricity in the mortuary and the refrigerators were not working. Can you imagine what it was like? There were dozens of corpses, and a decision was made to make a mass grave close to a cemetery of World War II soldiers. No one knows the exact number of how many people died. People got organized and held a referendum to secede from Ukraine. We witnessed the Crimean experience, and we firmly believed that we would have the same results. First, we would declare independence from Ukraine, say goodbye, and be back to our motherland. We should have listened to President Putin, who told us we were rushing ahead with the referendum. He told us not to go ahead with the referendum. But our people thought that it was a diplomatic message, and nobody listened to him. We still went ahead with the referendum in May 2014. I've never in my life seen so many people coming out to vote in a referendum. Before the war, as a journalist, I covered electoral campaigns. The enthusiasm of the people was incomparable. The organizing was perfect. People stood in long lines to vote. Everything was orderly and without trouble. There was no pressure to vote. It was like a holiday, and everyone hoped to return home to the motherland. Almost 90% voted for the independence of Lugansk, and the People's Republic of Lugansk was announced. The referendum itself was a big no to Ukraine. We told Ukraine that we didn't want to live with them as one country. The situation is the same today. We know about the Minsk agreement, and we understand that it is politics, but we do not want to live with Ukraine under any circumstances. 99 people out of 100 will tell you the same thing. Historically, Donbass was not part of Ukraine, but was artificially included by the Bolsheviks, and it turned out to be a big mistake, because they tried to incorporate non-Ukrainian regions into Ukraine. Ukrainian was never spoken in the Donbass region, except for a few small villages. In the cities, the Ukrainian language could only be heard in Ukrainian language classes. Ukrainian language was never spoken all over Ukraine. The American Gallup organization in 2010 conducted a poll that showed that 73% of the people in Ukraine spoke Russian in everyday life. Only in villages did people speak different dialects of Ukrainian. In 2012, I went as part of the Lugansk delegation to Lvov in western Ukraine, and I talked to their mayor and asked him, what was the percentage of Russian-speaking people in Lvov? He told me openly that it was a big problem because out of 1 million people, one-third, 350,000, were Russian speakers. And this is Lvov, the capital of Ukrainian nationalism. Now they are implementing total Ukrainization and fining those who speak Russian. In a few years, they will do like they did in the Baltic states when they are fining people for using Russian in everyday life. There are several scenarios for the outcome of this conflict. It is a choice between bad, worst, and the worst. Whichever scenario works out, Ukraine is a failed state. On the one hand, entire institutions were destroyed in Ukraine. On the other hand, they didn't exist. For example, is a child with no kidneys able to survive? It doesn't matter how much dialysis is given, the child will not be able to survive on its own. The same with Ukraine. It cannot survive without outside donors. Ukrainian industries are almost totally destroyed. There are a few industries that are controlled by oligarchs, but these are old Soviet-era industries that are no longer efficient. The electric generating stations of Ukraine are 90% worn out, and no one is building new ones. Now, Ukraine lives for today. It cannot think about tomorrow. Today, the goal of the ruling class is to steal resources and money and run away and they're being very successful. What is sad, there is no idea of Ukrainian identity. For example, Russia and America have their distinct national identities. Russia, America, and Great Britain are empires. Even without an imperial background, take Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, or Finland. They are small, independent states with their own national identities. But Ukraine is only now trying to establish a national identity, borrowing it from the outside. Ukraine, above all, like German, über alles. Ukraine never had its own national identity. It has failed to create a national identity after the breakup of the Soviet Union. It has been a 25-year experiment. As a result, Ukraine has split into parts, with Crimea and Donbass leaving. Crimea was lucky, Donbass was less lucky, but nevertheless, for 6 years, with arms in our hands, we are saying goodbye to Ukraine. Things are getting worse. This year, Ukraine will have to repay a $6 billion loan. Where will it get the money? Default has already happened, but they do not want to announce it. America is printing money in order to support this smoldering conflict on Russia's borders. It doesn't invest in Ukraine. The West destroyed the infrastructure and industries in Bulgaria and the Baltic states, and the same will happen in Ukraine. This is how it works all over the world. Ukraine has even more problems. 40% of the electricity is generated by old nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and 90% of coal-powered electric power stations are worn out. These stations cannot operate without Donbass coal, and today they are buying their coal either through Russia or Europe. Ukraine has let its gas industry decay, so Russia has built 2 new pipelines around Ukraine. Without transferring Russian gas to Europe, Ukraine will actually lose $3 to $4 billion a year and have no Russian gas for itself. Without gas and coal, how will they heat their houses? The economy is not working. Where will Ukraine find the money to cover their debts? Ukraine is not as wealthy as the United States, which is trillions of dollars in debt. Ukraine is a poor country involved in war. This country is on the verge of collapse. It is just a matter of time when it happens. Russia does not need a collapsing country on its border. America is encouraging Armageddon in Ukraine. When Ukraine is reaching default, Russia will give it gas and electricity to stay warm in winter. Russia, in fact, will slow down the collapse. If Russia really were at war with Ukraine, it would completely stop the gas delivered to Ukraine, which would cause an apocalypse in Ukraine. Russia is trying to prevent this. I repeat, the confrontation today is between the West and the United States against Russia on the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine is simply a battlefield with trenches on 2 sides. On one side is Russia, and on the other side is the United States and the West. Until the sides in the trenches come to terms, nothing will happen. The solution to this conflict is in Washington. Today, America is losing control of the world. In Afghanistan, you lost to the Taliban. You will soon leave Iraq. In the Middle East, even Turkey did not follow your advice and bought Russian S-400 systems. You didn't allow Turkey to buy American planes, so Turkey will buy them from Russia. And you trapped yourself dealing with China. The U.S. dislikes Russia, not because Russia did something in Crimea or in Kiev. This is a historic global confrontation. Russia is the only country in the world which could destroy America. In the era of nuclear weapons, there is no sense to create another arms race. For every new sword, there will be a new shield. It will have no end. America is trapping itself with higher stakes and trying to get other countries to live according to American rules. This will not work.
не выйдет. И поверьте, Россия не
Russia
хочет
would
это
gladly
терпеть.
cooperate and trade with
Россия бы с
America.
удовольствием бы с вами
There have been a
торговала,
lot
с
of peace
удовольствием бы с вами
proposals from
дружила.
Russia,
И таких
but
вот,
America is constantly creating problems for Russia.
миролюбия было сделано огромное количество.
Imagine if Russia would start creating problems for America in Cuba or Venezuela by deploying missiles which could reach America. What would you do? Do you want a third world war?
Понимаете?